Hi there, Frans.
Hello, Greg. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Still good, thank you.
Great. I'm very happy to have these microphones today. It's improvement since the last video, and I'm hoping that going forward we can keep improving. In today's video, we are tackling chapter 4 of Frans Rautenbach's book, South Africa Can Work. In the previous video, we tackled chapter 3, and if I remember correctly, we looked at rent-seeking, dived quite deep into that. And in today's episode, we're looking at chapter 4, which is also about rent-seeking, but from a slightly different angle. So chapter 4 is called The Free Market, Bulwark Against Rent-Seeking. So I thought a good place to start, Frans, would be with the word bulwark, because that's not a word that I am familiar with, and perhaps other readers aren't familiar with it either.
Okay, well, as I indicated to you earlier, I don't know the origin of the word. It has some, but it is a metaphor, and what it means is it's an antidote or a counter or something to fight the scourge of rent-seeking with. So it is that which is the medicine that we must take if we are sick with rent-seeking. That's the effect of it.
Okay, so basically it's about an antidote to rent-seeking.
That's it, yeah. And the reason why that is so is because, as I've indicated in our previous discussion, merit is what defines whether you have rent-seeking or not. The fundamental definition of rent-seeking is that it removes all merit from the equation. People get something for nothing. They don't earn what they get. And you don't deliver that which is relevant to the transaction. You don't do what you're supposed to do in order to fulfill the purpose of the transaction.
Right.
Another way of looking at it is to say you're not productive or sufficiently productive, and that which you get is mahala, something for nothing.
Right.
And that's really why the free market is such a bulwark against it, because what it does is it effectively ensures that we place value on things.
Right.
May I maybe perhaps interrupt your questioning for a second and just say that I've occupied my mind recently by thinking, what is wrong with Marxism or socialism from a moral point of view? And one of the things, and it may not be a complete answer, but one of the things that I've come up with, which is really important to me, is the idea that what socialism cannot do, and the market can, is place a value on things.
Right. Very good point.
And you know, there's the wonderfully astute saying that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. Now, this is not quite the same, because I think what the market does is it places a price on everything and thereby enables the participants to have a value. Take an example. If I render a service, I sell pictures or artifacts. Someone can come in and they can buy that artifact. Now, it is easy to say, well, you can place an objective value on an artifact, on a work of art, for example. But we all know that one purchaser will place a different value on the item that he buys to what another person would place on it.
Right.
So the value is a subjective thing. You know the famous story about the two guys who walk in the desert, and the one has a bottle of water, but he's hungry, and the other one has a bag of food, but he's desperately thirsty. Now, they can, by concluding a voluntary exchange transaction, enormously enhance the life quality of each one of them. Their experience of life in that moment in time can increase. And there is no limit to the value that the bottle of water would have for the thirsty man and the bag of food for the hungry man. You can't say, well, it is worth so much, because there is no such thing as objective value. And that is why it is wonderful that we have the mechanism of the market where an exchange can take place and we can agree on a price. And that price will be a measure of what something is worth. And
Right.
I think from a moral point of view, once you take that mechanism out of the equation,
We can't really determine what has value.
what has value and
How
what
much
doesn't,
things
and how
cost.
much things are. And that has profound implications, moral implications, because if you think of the typical transaction, let's say we make furniture, we make this table. Now, someone who has to buy the table has a very good idea for what the value is, because that consumer knows how much she or he needs it and how much he or she is prepared to pay for it. And in order to get it, you are very astutely aware of the value, because you have to work to get the money in order to buy it. So you have to give up labor in order to be able to buy. So the old saying of, they know where it's coming from. It's coming out of your pocket, but your pocket in turn is coming out of the hard work, the sweat that you've put in. And that measure of sweat determines whether it is really worth what it is really worth in the marketplace. But if you are an official of the state and you're working with other people's money, you have no conception of that, because you're working with other people's wealth and you don't appreciate it. Similarly, if somebody gets something for free, the rent-seeking situation, which we've discussed at length, for example, with reference to welfare last time.
Right.
Someone who receives something as a form of welfare receives it for nothing in return, and there is no conception of the value. So it's no wonder that in the state you find low productivity and eventually corruption.
Right.
That on the side of the receivers of the handouts, you find total waste, because there's no incentive to preserve and
Right.
to develop things.
No one's
productively.
accountable.
Yes.
Yeah.
You get it for free.
Yeah.
And on the part of those who make everything, of course, there is the terrible realization that what is the point of making it if I'm going to have to give it away, or it's going to be taken away?
I recently had that experience. I became a freelancer about 2 months ago. I'm in my 3rd month now. Yeah, and I was previously employed, so working for a studio, so my tax was coming off automatically, and now I have to take care of that myself. And I finally got round to calculating the tax bracket that I would fall under, and when I calculated it myself, it hit me like a ton of bricks, because I didn't think it'd be so high, and I finally understood. It finally hit me just what it might feel like to be dramatically, to have the incentive for work like taken out from underneath me. Because I looked at the amount of tax that I'd have to pay, and I just thought, wow, I don't know. It was a profound moment, and I just thought, wow, like what happens in a state where, I don't know, where they take virtually everything, or where you're expected to, where the state owns everything. I felt that grayness, that dullness, that people that talk about when they, based on what I've read about socialism and communism, people seem to describe kind of a dullness in the air, sort of anticlimactic mood. Yeah. And I felt that in that moment. So I totally identify with what you're saying.
There's an occurrence which takes place about May or June every year, and it normally goes later every year. And when organizations like the Free Market Foundation, for example, announces today is tax, I think they call it Tax Freedom Day, which is the first day of the year that you actually start working for yourself. All the rest before that went to the state. If you should divide it up into two lumps.
Wow.
Like that, the before and after. Before for the state and after for yourself.
Sure.
So that is quite... that's quite a daunting thought.
Yes.
And then you think of some of the states to the north of us, the fairly wealthy countries, where they take up to 60% for the state. And it's no wonder that those countries start growing slower and slower as time goes by.
Right.
All right, so that was a little
little
excursus on my part, just
note.
to say that... but I'll come back to this idea that value is basically what's at the heart of all of this.
I think we come back at some point in this chapter. You do refer back to socialism and alternatives to a free market, and so I have some more questions about that. But let's actually start from the beginning of this chapter now. So in the beginning of this chapter, you talk about. You use a definition for a mental disorder.
Yes.
And I'm just going to read it. So you say, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, defines a mental disorder as follows: a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is associated with present distress or disability, or with a significantly increased risk of suffering, death, pain, disability, or an important loss of freedom. And then, so that's end quote, then you say, this best describes how I feel about South Africa and its relationship with the free market system. Can you just unpack that?
Yeah, the psychologists will say to you that mental disorder is fundamentally about pain. It's about people suffering as a result of some state of affairs which exists in their make up their mental state or their psyche, and which causes them to suffer needlessly and unnecessarily to have a very, very difficult time.
And do you think one of the key features of this is that it occurs within them?
It is within you in the sense
it's
that
not some external thing.
One of the difficulties is that, as I understand it, and I'm no psychologist, but I understand that one of the difficulties is to make someone see what he's actually missing. He doesn't realize that he does the same thing.
It's like a blind spot,
and he walks into the same wall all the time. And that's how I feel about the South African society. We're sitting with 10 million unemployed people. We're sitting with endless suffering. We're sitting with a situation. I saw the figures this morning where I think if you earn above 19,000 Rand a month, you're in the top 1% or something like that.
What, are you serious?
And the rest are below. And the vast majority of people are in the categories which are defined as poor or destitute. So you are really, really poor in half of, at least half or more of the population.
Wow.
And you say to yourself, it does not have to be like that. And that is how I feel about, that's why I use the metaphor of mental illness, because it is actually something which you can do something about if you can, and you can avoid all that unnecessary suffering. There is in fact an answer. It sits there.
Right. So you think that answer is the free market system, and right? That's correct.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you're right. You say here the free market system is an economic system of voluntary exchange of goods and services, rather than an economic system of voluntary exchange of goods and services rather than through the dictates of government. And then you say it's the most powerful engine for growth and prosperity known to humankind. So okay, so if you haven't watched these videos already, okay, it's pretty obvious that you're preaching to the choir. But let's just unpack this, and I think I want to pretend that I'm some sort of very liberal socialist student who thinks that sure, capitalism has some good parts, but it does a whole lot of bad, and that even though it's led to a lot of growth, there's just so much negativity attached to it. There's so much inequality it creates. How would you justify or explain the appeal of this engine of growth for growth?
Okay. I think maybe a good starting point is to look at what should be a framework that both you and I can agree on.
Right.
And that is, I think both of us will find it unobjectionable if I say to you, freedom is a value that everybody prizes.
Right.
Individual freedom. I think it's difficult to argue with that.
You know what's strange though, Frans, and quite scary is that I get a sense. I mean, I agree with you 200%, but I am genuinely, increasingly becoming concerned that people are losing touch with the concept of freedom. That's a conversation for another time. Yeah. But look, for the purpose of this conversation, I do agree.
But if I say to you as my hypothetical debating partner that we can agree on the principle of universal freedom,
yes,
it's unobjectionable. I
yeah,
don't think so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me use this example, which I often use. It's the John Rawls's experiment of the blind visitor from outer space.
Right.
To use a modern metaphor. You come here from outer space. You know you're going to become a human being, but you don't know who you're going to be.
Right.
You're going to be rich or poor. You're going to be black or white. You're going to be
in a socialist
male
country
or female. You're going to land up in Russia or China or South
America.
Africa or America. You just don't know. You're going to be clever or less intelligent. Would you rather have universal freedom to determine the outcome of your life or not? Could there be a debate? You don't know who you're going to be. I cannot see that anybody will say, I don't want the freedom. I don't want the freedom. So that's a one point. And the second point is...
So we both want freedom.
We both want freedom. The second point I'll say to you is, do you agree that you own your own body? And... again, I think it's unobjectionable.
Yes.
If I suggest to you that somebody or something else owns your body and can determine what to do with your body, I think there's not a person alive who, unless they are insane, will accept that. And from that, will you accept that as a moral proposition, then it is indisputable that owning your body as you do, you can do with your body what you want in terms of using it to work, producing things, making things
exchanging
for yourself, exchanging things.
Yes.
Determining your outcome. And will you agree that for the poor people out there, the ordinary person out there, in fact, for anybody out there, it is fundamental to the dignity of their existence that they are able to make their own way in the world. That they can say, I can actually provide for my family, I can provide for myself, I don't have to look anyone in the eyes, I don't have to hold out my hand in begging. I don't need the state to look after me as a charity case. Again, I think if anybody is honest, that is an unobjectionable proposition. And once we say that, then I think we're getting closer to the situation where, from a moral point of view, we say to each other that it is a preferable state of affairs that we own that which we make or acquire through swapping or buying, and that we are free to make our way in the commercial world. As an individual. I don't think anybody, when he looks at it from his own perspective, wants that to happen. wants the state to take things away or dictate how he must behave. It's only when we talk about other people
Right.
that we are quick to say, oh, no, but the rich people should give up this and that and the other thing. So that's just the one part of the framework, the sort of, call it the moral framework within which this operates. And I think it is unobjectionable, and any right-thinking person is likely to agree with you.
But again, how do we communicate that message? How do we communicate that a free market is the most powerful engine for growth and prosperity known to humankind?
Okay.
So I can agree with you on everything you've just said, but
that still doesn't mean it works to make growth possible.
Let's imagine the socialist, the student who's convinced that capitalism is just the worst thing on the planet. How do we win that kind of person over? Can we unpack this idea, this engine for growth idea?
Yes. All right. Now, again, I'm going to use the argument or the explanation in the abstract, and then we can go to the concrete evidence. The abstract principle is this. When two people in a free market exchange something, now that can be labor for wages, or money for goods, or goods for goods, or whatever the case may be. We can arrange to exchange. And it's a voluntary exchange, which is the fundamental principle of the free market. We both agree at that point in time that we want what the other person has to offer, and the other person agrees that he wants what I have to offer. That means, as a matter of absolute logic, that both of us will be better off after the transaction than before. That must be so. There's no other outcome possible, because otherwise we wouldn't enter into the transaction.
Yes.
To come back to the example that I mentioned earlier of the man in the desert with a bag of food and the other one with the water, both of them will be inestimably better off after the transaction. Now imagine that same transaction or transactions similar to that take place millions and billions of times every day.
Yeah.
That's the free market. Every one of those people are better off after the event.
Right.
So, now let's take it more concrete. Let's take my favorite example of the furniture factory. Just think through this. When we have a furniture factory, we have an employer and employees. Employer is the entrepreneur, employees, and we have consumers out there. And they form the tripod or the triangle, if you like, of the basic transaction in a free market. We take a piece of wood, which is not worthless, but as it is, it's a potential resource. It can be exploited, but as a piece of wood stumped from a tree, it is not very useful. But while with the employer's knowledge and technology and so on, he's able to direct things in such a way that piece of wood can become a useful table. He can, in other words, add value to the wood, thereby creating something of value, a form of wealth. At the same time, he can't do it alone. He needs the employees to come and help do the actual work. He obviously needs to get the capital, the machinery or whatever. They add value to the wood, they create a table, and the consumer comes in and the consumer buys a table.
Right.
The effect of that is that all three of them are better off.
Right.
The employee, whereas he or she would have starved before without the work, now has an income from which they can buy tables and food and maybe a car or a taxi ride or whatever the case may be, rent a house, etc., buy a telephone and so on. So they're better off. The employer is better off because he can make a profit. He can take the wood, which is now had value added to it, and he can sell it at a profit. That much he can either pocket, spend it on something else, or he can invest it in something else.
Right.
third possibility, the third instance is the consumer whose life quality is immeasurably enhanced because the same consumer, through the fruits of his or her labor, buys cell phones, smartphones, computers, flats, cars, TVs, internet systems, and all the other wonderful things that make life possible, and health services and everything else. All of that, the result of voluntary exchange. So through these thousands and thousands of transactions, which we don't even think about in the course of our day, each and every one of those people are better off. So that's the mechanism by which this is possible.
Okay, so that's the mechanism. But again, what do you say to someone that says, okay, I hear you. That's the mechanism. Okay, I get that we're all free, but the system tends toward it tends toward inequality. It tends toward a sort of disproportionate distribution of wealth.
Yeah.
And it's not fair. So my intuitive response, so my feeling, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, is it seems like there's almost a, Jordan Peterson talks about this. He talks about a war on competence. And I wanted to know if you think that's a factor in the kind of resistance that people have to the free market and their inclination to support more kind of, you describe statist economic doctrines or social democracies.
Yes.
It's almost like people they can't handle the responsibility of determining their own way. They want a system that kind of takes care of everyone.
Yeah. Look, it's let me just say to you that I think there are two kinds of inequality. There's good inequality and bad inequality.
Yeah.
Let's start with the good inequality. And I know now I'm taking a tiger by the tail. How can inequality ever be good? Example. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs both changed the world as we know it by the ingenuity of themselves and their teams, by developing things which so enhanced the quality of life of everybody, including even the poor people in Africa who are now able on a smartphone to access the internet and make banking transactions. These are the products of the free market. These people enhance the quality of lives of billions, literally billions of people. Now,
sorry.
What I'm saying to you is that is something which is really valuable and is in very high demand. The price system says to us, according to the huge demand created, the services of those people should be rewarded in some form or fashion. Now, I don't think anybody argues with that. There are very few people. If you honestly ask a person out there whether the entrepreneur's fruits of his labor should bring a profit which will reward him adequately for his innovation, I think it's really difficult to justify why that should not be the case. Now, I'll tell you why. Because everybody wants that right for themselves. One of the things...
And if they take it away from the entrepreneur, they're taking it away from themselves.
They take it away from everybody.
Right.
Why you know that is if you look at the immigration figures of the United States, Singapore, Hong Kong, Switzerland, all the free market paradises. What you find is their immigration figure, the number of
people going
people
there,
who live there percentage-wise as a proportion of the population is 10 times higher than the average. Their immigration figure is on average about 30%, the top 10 free markets in the world. 30% of the people living there are immigrants. Now, why? Why do people go there if these places are so horrible and exploitative? Yeah. They go there because they see that enormous inequality, because that stands for potential.
Yes.
That means this is a country where poor people can get rich. That's why they go there. And that is why the inequality is not a bad thing. It creates that incentive to become an entrepreneur yourself, to go and work in the first place yourself, because you know there's the possibility of upward mobility. Ask any of those immigrants who are stopped at the American border now and being sent back, why they come there. They go there because there are jobs, opportunities, and businesses. So those upward mobility opportunities are inherent to the free market, and there's nowhere else in the world and no other time in the world where that has happened in such a spectacular fashion as in a free market now.
I think what you're speaking to is what it seems so obvious, and yet at the same time it seems people are very unaware of it. All you have to do is think about successful people, whether it's in business or whether it's in sports or whether it's in academia. It's always a minority of people who are very, very good. I mean, the people who run the fastest are a tiny minority of people who run. Yes. The people who make the most money are a tiny percentage of people who make money. It's like I mean, again, Jordan Peterson is the one who brought my attention to this. It's always going to be a pyramid with very few at the top and many, many, many at the bottom.
Yeah.
And it just seems like there are people, I think that there's something quite inevitable and unavoidable about that. And yet it seems like there's a lot of resistance, at least, especially amongst younger people nowadays, to that paradigm. How can we win people over? How can we convince people that it is in their interest to kind of buy into the system?
Well, I think you must define people, because I don't think it's the ordinary people out there. I honestly think that what happens is, first of all, people in academia and politicians and in the media.
Right.
In other words, the sort of intellectual elite, if you like, buy into the socialist idea.
Yeah, because I mean, you write here, sorry, this is on page 53, at the beginning of chapter 4. You say commentators and politicians by and large treat the free market system with disdain. I suspect this has something to do with the notion that free enterprise is too simplistic or old-fashioned. And then you say, it has become far cooler to follow some form of social democracy or other statist economic doctrine.
Yeah.
Cool, but delusional.
Absolutely.
That's what you say.
And let me just add to that I've now come to the shocking realization that not only social democracy and other statist, but in fact downright socialist models. I saw a series of videos on YouTube recently. I don't know if you've come across them. I don't have the name. It's a Russian guy who lived in the USSR until he was 29, and then in the Reagan era immigrated to America.
Wow.
And he says that obviously changed his life. Ironically, he also has a furniture factory.
Yeah.
Which is a metaphor I've used for a long, long time, but this guy happens to have a furniture factory.
Wow.
And he's doing very well. He thinks America and free enterprise is the most wonderful thing ever. And he says, you have no idea how miserable it was. Yeah. And he was there. He knows what he's talking about. He says it was absolutely awful to live there. And he has, in the meantime, found his freedom, become prosperous. And he now asks students at these marches and protests and so on. And to hear the answers of the students who actually passionately tell you that they believe that America should become a socialist country. If it weren't so serious, you would really want to crack up laughing because you cannot believe the things that people say. And of course, he doesn't tell them he's Russian. Yeah. So he first gets them to explain to him how socialism works. And then they say, well, suppose you have this factory, a furniture factory. How is it going to work? And it's basically these abstractions of, no, we will go in there and we will take over the factory, and then the workers will run the factory and they will know what furniture to buy and how to design the furniture and so on. And most unbelievable ideas. Of course, everybody is now infused with this idea of democracy. So that which of course makes it all that much worse, because you now have everybody is now going to be an expert on everything. So that's a further sort of a modern twist.
Right.
We've now become aware that democracy is cool, and we can't somehow say that the state must dictatorially and authoritatively dictate to us.
Yeah.
But now everybody is an expert. So the workers will run the factory by committee or something like that. And you just despair. It is so unrealistic that you want to run away. But the point is that, to come back to your question, the elite, if you can turn the elite, you can turn the tide, because the elite are the ones who actually dictate to the ordinary voters out there through social media, through the media, through teachings in universities, and through political campaigns. And because I think it's the politicians, but the tide turns. Ultimately, of course, my view is that the only real teacher is experience.
Right.
It's a good thing we're talking now, because we've just seen the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil. And Brazil was well on its way to becoming a second Venezuela.
Really?
About 10 years ago, socialism was flying. You will remember that in Brazil we had a commodities boom, which rode on the back of China's expansions. They imported copper and iron and coal and steel and all kinds of commodities from Brazil, that is its economy. It is effectively a commodities economy. And of course, all those booms turn into bust eventually. The tide turns. And then the state starts spending more and more and more. And Brazil has very, very high state spending for a state of its income, even higher on some measures than South Africa, which is really high. And the state became bigger and bigger. And of course, inevitably, that large hand of a state, especially a diverse society like that, leads to corruption. Huge state-owned enterprises, Petrobras, which is their oil company, was then embroiled in a massive social corruption scandal.
Yeah.
And the point being that what then happened was that at some point the unemployment started going up, the misery started increasing, it got out of hand, and the state could no longer maintain the facade that this was a prosperous society. And they kicked out the government. They've changed completely, and Bolsonaro has promised a free market. Now, he has his detractors, and I have criticized him enormously for some of the things he said. But the one thing he seems to get right is he understands that there must be a free market.
Right.
So what I'm saying is experience is ultimately the best teacher. So if you really want to convince people, and you want to you will sweep the politicians away, as we've seen it, the Brazil example being a good one. You will sweep, the same thing happened in Chile 35 years ago. You will recall that was it Pinochet who came to power in Chile with a military dictatorship. But what he got right was he invited the School of Economics of Chicago, who was closely linked to Milton Friedman at the time, to come and advise his government on how
Wow.
to transform. So again, the fact that you don't have democracy at the outset is very often not fatal, because what happens is as economic freedom increases, you have found time and again, and Chile is one example, the democracy, the human rights start getting better and better, because the market is a powerful thing. People with money and prosperity start demanding things, and it gradually starts changing. So what happened is Chile became a democracy, and I have no doubt that if free market reforms are successfully carried through in Brazil, we will see a beating back of corruption and all these nasty things.
It seems like people really, and I wonder if it's not because we haven't had it's because we haven't had any significant struggle. I mean, monumental struggle, the likes of the sort of Second World War or anything on that scale. It seems like people are too comfortable, and therefore they almost put too much faith in leaders to be honest,
themselves.
to be honest and authentic, and to manage things effectively. And it just seems, I don't know, it just seems so strange to me that people expect other mortal humans with all this power and authority to use it responsibly. I mean, of course they're gonna end up being corrupt if they own everything, or if they're not accountable,
and they have the power to levy taxes and expropriate things.
I mean, they're just people.
It's unbelievable. Quite apart from the fact that from an economic point of view, those things just don't work, because the first thing an investor says, this is the last place that I want to put my money in, because it's uncertain. People can take your things, because the government ultimately consists of people, and it's the whims of people that determine what they're going to do with your money, your income, your taxes, and ultimately your property, and further ultimately your life. It's that bad. That is what Soviet Russia has shown us. That is what China has shown us. Literally millions of people died, and it's the same all over. Venezuela is now people literally dying of hunger. It's absolutely awful. It is not using the term lightly. It is one of those things that fills you with terror. It is so bad.
Right.
So those are the only things which I think ultimately make people change their minds, is experience. I'm terribly frustrated, as I've said last time, with our political parties who are not seizing the moment. One of the opposition parties to encamp in the townships and start speaking to the unemployed, because we know that those are the needs. The unemployed people there are two things which come out tops every time as the most important problems: unemployment and lack of education. Because that one leads to the other. Employment is a form of education, and education enables you to get a job. And those things, that's where we should. But people don't speak to the unemployed in that way. They promise them false things. They promise them more handouts. They say that we will create jobs for you, but that's not a good way. You've got to explain how the current system is robbing them of their jobs, how the trade union is taking their jobs away. Concretize the problem.
So, Frans, I just want to pull us back to the book here. So, on page 54, you say that aversion to the free market idea has been exacerbated in the media recently through the attack on so-called neoliberalism. And then you go into a little bit about neoliberalism, and then eventually you say it's important to understand what a free market is and what it's not. So can we just unpack neoliberalism a bit, and then let's actually kind of discuss what the free market is and what it's not.
That's right. That's it's a good question because it answers the second part of the earlier question about inequality. I hinted that there's a bad part of inequality.
Right.
And the bad kind of inequality is this. What is now derisively called neoliberalism is really a form of what some people call crony capitalism. It's where the state gets into bed with big corporate affairs. That, to me, the most terrible example ever, because of its consequences, is the fact that a person like Donald Rumsfeld in the Bush cabinet, who was the Minister of Defense, Secretary of Defense, also owned $1 billion and more in interests in the arms industry.
Yeah.
Same person who declared war on Iraq also sold weapons to both the Pentagon and other institutions.
Yeah.
Now, you don't have to go further than that. That is the worst example, and there are others. Now, when that happens, when the state becomes all powerful and it gets into bed with powerful corporate bodies, that causes huge inequality, because those people just reap the rewards of their privileged position. Another example of the same principle is the money system, which I've dedicated an entire chapter to. But it's a simple point that I'm simplifying, but the central banks and the Reserve and the United States print money, in effect, thereby benefiting the rich people, because rich people can borrow money from banks. And what do they do with that money? They don't put it back in the pockets of the poor. They buy shares in companies. So you have found that the share values of American equities have gone up enormously over the last 30 years in the net result. And those growth instances have not been in the form of mortars and bricks and machines and training of workers and all the nice things that we need to input into our businesses in order to become more productive. And it is no coincidence that on those 30 or 40 years, since about 1980, we have gradually seen a decline in American productivity. It's a terrible thing. Productivity is what makes the prosperity increase.
Right.
And we've seen that the amount of wealth is not related to productivity growth. There's a departure. The productivity line runs further and further below. And as a result of that, you have more and more. That's where I think the story of the richest 1% gets so much and owns so much, all of those forms of inequality. And they are severe.
Yeah.
But the most important thing is that what has happened in America, I believe, is that the actual income, and there are many calculations of this, but the actual income of the middle class and the poor in the first world has come down. And that's the bad kind of inequality. Yeah. And why that's important is that is what a free market is not. You asked me that question, and that kind of so-called because it's called neoliberalism, but it's nothing liberal. There's nothing liberal about that, because it's the state which is causing all of these things by printing money or by becoming involved in arms manufacture or all these other evils.
If I understand you correctly, it's not necessarily capitalism. It's that capitalism and the free market is hijacked by the state.
Yes.
And the state gets into bed with the capitalists at the top of the pyramid.
Absolutely.
Right.
I have no question about it. When people talk about the excesses of capitalism, it's not the excesses of capitalism, it's the excesses of the state, which enables itself to get more and more power, and using that power to hijack the corporates And vice versa. The corporates very often hijack the state, as we've seen in South Africa. The Gupta Gate scandal, which is state capture, is an extreme form of, quote, neoliberalism, unquote. But it's got nothing to do with the free market. That's the state having too much power and then corporates able to exploit it.
And that has nothing to do with the average entrepreneur who's hired 5 people and who's actually, trying to make a life for himself and is actually contributing to the economy.
That's in fact a contradiction of it's a serious denial of the rule of law, which is, as we know, an essential ingredient of a free market. Is to have a rule of law where you have a neutral set of laws, which will before which everybody is in principle equal, and no one gets favors or disfavors from officials, people,
right,
by their whim. There's no possibility of that. That is a true free market, and that's the ideal. There's no single market that achieves that, but the closer we get, the better. So that is one thing a free market is not.
So, in talking about what the free market is and what the free market is not, you bring up consumerism. And you say sometimes consumerism is identified as the essence of a free market and a scourge to be rooted out. Yet many ordinary people enjoy the enormous benefits of profit-driven consumer goods, such as smartphones, internet access, as well as improved life quality. I mean, I feel I love that point because I just, I think that there's so much hypocrisy in people who criticize capitalism, and yet they do so on their smartphone, or they do so on Twitter or Facebook, which are sort of some of the greatest fruits of that system. How would you explain to someone that? How would you unpack that point for someone to sort of drive it home?
Well, I think that what you do is you say, go and imagine that you are a poor rural farmer in China who struggled from day to day to eke out a living. Farming. Mostly with manual farming techniques, planting your rice in the mud, harvesting, walking to work, walking back, sleeping in a hovel. And one day, around about 1980, things started changing, and the government said to you, you're allowed not only to sell these things in the open market at a price which you can accommodate an agreement with somebody, but you now also have access to all the wonderful technologies and things gradually. First you can buy a bicycle, and then you can maybe buy a bakkie, and then eventually you can buy tools
and a computer at some stage,
and you can do your accounting, and suddenly you feel you become more productive. And that is, in fact, what has happened in China. They unleashed the market, and you go and say to those people, any one of them, what do you think of the evil of consumerism? The right to buy a cell phone or a bicycle or a car. They will laugh at you. They will say, are you absolutely out of your mind? There is nothing that has improved our lives as much as that. So I just think that we have lost all perspective. People who say that are eventually, that you'll find that if you push them long enough, they have nowhere to hide, because there's no way that they can maintain the holier than thou logic of their arguments and still maintain what is the most luxurious lifestyle we have known in the history of the earth. Ever. And that's happened over the last 200 years or so.
What I always bring them up, but the question that Peterson asks people when they bring up the sort of criticism about the West or about capitalism is he says, he always says, like, compared to what? And And I think it's just a great blunt question. It's like, compared to what? I mean, what exactly is the alternative? I don't know.
Well, and the other point that he makes, which I have thought about quite a bit lately, is this idea of nature red in tooth and claw. You know, the fact that 200 years or 300 years ago, the survival struggle of people was bitter. People barely got older than 30 years. People had what we now know as normal existence.
Yeah.
We think it's a natural state of affairs.
In the book that I'm reading now, the Strange Death of Europe, he talks about losing touch with the tragic dimension of life.
Yes.
The inherent tragedy of struggling to survive.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's life is for the millennia that preceded this was absolutely bitter. War was the order of the day, and anything that you wanted to do took manual struggle, and it never stopped. And we have finally got to a point where you have things like free time. Some might argue way too much of it. You know, I don't think it need be that way. I think that's a personal choice. But it is unbelievable what people get up to, because they seem not to see the forest for the trees. They are absolutely myopic in their luxury.
It's a really interesting point you just made about the sort of the indulgence of free time, the kind of indulgence in free time. I mean, I'm guilty of that as well, and sometimes I have to catch myself. I mean, it's a Sunday, we're making this video, so I don't think I'm doing too bad. But
hopefully someone looks at it.
Yeah, but I do agree that it's a fascinating question. I mean, are people simply too idle, or do people have too much time to sort of not consider how hard life is, or I don't know. It's
I think it's at the moment there's simply a lack of perspective.
Historical.
There's very little historical
appreciation,
perspective. There are also serious problems which cause these populist ideas to take hold. I mean, one mustn't have any illusion about the importance of, because of these difficulties that we've identified, such as what I called, in quotation marks, neoliberalism, where you have the corporates in bed with government, which then causes, in the developing world, relative deprivation. And I'm saying relative with emphasis, because the so-called poor in the United States, for example, are all people with houses and jobs and cars and TVs and air conditioning, but they're still relatively worse off. And they might even be worse off than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And that is important. Now, those problems, I think, are at heart. That, and then the perceived threat of immigration. Those are the things which someone like Donald Trump has been able to exploit, and which caused the backlash, the populist backlash, which may then go wrong. And that in turn causes polarization, and the left now hits back with more extreme forms of policy and ideology, such as nowadays, as I say, socialism. More and more people think socialism is cool for America. And you just ask them how it's going to work. And it turns out it's there's a wonderful there's a wonderful video about where someone approaches a woman on the street, and she's a busker. She makes a living out of, and he asks her that question which I posed earlier: "From who's the owner of your body? Who makes the music?
Yeah.
And what do you want?" And it turns out that every time he poses the possibility that someone is to take over and control and confiscate, she says, no. And eventually she conceded, yes, I actually think a free market is a good idea. Because one loses that perspective. If you because you take things for granted.
It's a powerful idea that, the way you've laid it out, it really kind of gets to the heart of the problem. The idea that you don't control your own body and you can't determine the contract, a contract between you and another person regarding your ability to produce something and a good or a service. Or, I mean, it really is quite striking the way you frame it like that.
Yeah, I think it's to me a very, very strong idea. I have two things in life to which I have a visceral reaction historically. The one is when I was about in my early 20s, I started working as an article clerk, and one day a letter arrived there from the South African Defence Force, and I had already done my national service at that stage. And it said, you've been called up for a camp for the next 2 weeks. You must report at so-and-so place.
Jeez.
I cannot tell you what that did to me on a psychological level. That sudden realization that if I don't obey, potentially they can force me to go at gunpoint or incarcerate me or do something. They have the power. That invasion of freedom, I cannot understand that anybody can want that.
Yeah.
And the other one is, of course, the old tax man. I cannot get my mind around it at a deep-seated psychological level, that there's justification for someone sitting up there in the hierarchies of the state to say, we want so much of the money that you have generated through your hard labor. We can come and take it.
Yeah.
I cannot understand that.
Yeah.
And if you break it down like that, I wonder if anybody really thinks that is something that he wants for himself.
Yeah.
It's always other people's money. And that is why we must get, there's the other expression, also a book title, is skin in the game. We must get our 10 million unemployed people to have skin in the game. Because the moment you find a job and you get property, your perspective changes, I think. Either that, or you have no skin in the game because you're so privileged. You're a trust fund kid, or you're someone who lives at home, or you're an eternal student living off the state. That's a big thing, hey? In the United States, but more so in Europe.
You mean through credit?
Through credit and very often
grants,
scholarships and grants. It's possible. I mean, in Sweden and those places, you can continue studying. For indefinitely. If you play your cards right, you can continue study almost indefinitely. Now, that which is fine. But at some point in time, society will stop working if everybody is not actually producing.
Yeah.
You need to have as many people as productive as possible. So that those things, it's almost as if the capitalist system is becoming a victim of its own success. That's what I think I'm saying to you. There's too much fat in the system, and as a result of that, all these other things cause people to lose perspective.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
And they become complacent. They lose the gratitude for what they have. So, Frans, you say here, in talking about what the free market is and what it isn't, you say another common misconception is the notion that South Africa has became a free market in 1994. And then you say, coupled with this idea, is the idea that the free market has now had some 20 years to prove itself, and that therefore South Africa's economic failure is evidence that the free market doesn't work.
Yeah.
Which I think is a very captivating argument would be a captivating argument to an opponent of yours.
Absolutely, and it's used all the time. And that's why I always say step back. What is a free market and what is a free market not?
Right.
Now, in order to talk about a free market, we need a quantitative framework. You need to be able to measure it.
Sorry, before I just want to, because I want to try and keep this sort of constrained to the chapter. So you've got here, you talk about the operation of the system. Crucial to the operation of the system is the price mechanism.
Yes.
And then this is aided by the essential ingredient of competition. And then this mechanism also works for the price of labor. So those are just three things that I highlighted. The sort of price mechanism, competition, and
the application to labor.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's a good idea that we just get the basic framework as far as that is concerned. Right? A free market is defined by the ability, as I say, to exchange either labor or goods for labor or goods.
Yeah, and the freedom of contract.
Freedom of contract underlies that. Now, that means you can set the price, and that is a fundamental of the free market. Now, why is that a good thing? I started out by saying the essential difference in my view between socialism and the market as far as a moral principle is concerned is the ability to appreciate the value of something. And a free market enables you to set prices. People do it automatically by agreement. That has a very important function because if there's a shortage of anything, the price goes up. So that creates a demand. Not the fact that the price goes up, but the fact that there's a shortage. That is reflected in an increase in price, which then says to the consumer, this is scarce, you must buy less of that. You must buy something else or save your money. But it also says to the entrepreneur, the price is going up, therefore this is a good area in which to invest because you can reap a profit. And what then happens is more and more investors come in and that shortage is then alleviated. And so the market always alleviates shortages. But at the same time, the price then starts coming down because more and more suppliers come in and they do it every time a new supplier comes in. He works on ways of supplying the same commodity more cheaply. So the price starts coming down. And that way you will find over time prices gradually come down. The things which you and I bought 10 years ago, electronics is a very good example.
Yeah.
Very, very expensive.
I was saying to my friend Jamie, who helped me with the setup today, I was just saying to him earlier today, he's also started a podcast. I was just remarking to him that the access that we have to this technology, I mean, the fact that we can, in a sense, have a sort of mini radio station in our lounge, I mean, it's really quite something.
Yes.
And it just, the only reason we've been able to do this is because the prices have just come down so dramatically that now we can afford to have a camera, we can have microphones and mic stands, and we can have a recorder. And so it's amazing how many opportunities open up.
And I have used the example before, but the smartphone is literally one of the smartest things ever invented in the sense that it has plus minus 10 functions, each of which would have been more expensive had you had to buy them separately 50 years ago in terms of the amount of labor that it took. And it's far better in quality than it used to be.
Absolutely.
A music center. I mean, what did you have to do in order to have music in your house 50 years ago? Or somewhere to type your text.
No, it's, I mean, if you really, I think we're so used to it now that when you take, again, I was talking to Daniel about the smartphone the other day. When you really take a step back from the smartphone, I mean, it's quite an absurd piece of machinery. It's mind-bogglingly advanced and delightful in how much it does. And one thinks if logic is of the market is anything to go by, we will laugh at these things in 50 years' time. I know, that's terrifying.
You get scared thinking about what will happen. You know?
No, I mean so Apple just did their latest product launch recently, and they've just released I don't know if it's released, but they released the sort of demo or the video explaining what the new iPad Pro is like. I mean, it's just staggering. It's more, the new iPad Pro. I think this is right. It's more powerful than 90% of computers on the market. Computers. So, I mean, that's the stage we're entering into now.
Fits into your top pocket.
Where these, and it's thin and it's light and you can draw on it. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Yeah.
Anyway, to come back to your question,
yeah.
That's the price mechanism. So price regulates it, but added to that, this price mechanism effect is enhanced enormously by competition. So the more businesses you have out there supplying things, the more they have to compete with each other in order to survive. And the only way they can do that is either by bringing down their prices, which explains why prices come down, partly explains why prices come down all the time. And the second way they can compete is by improving the quality of what they offer. And the third thing they can do is by innovating, by producing new products. So that's why I started out by saying to you earlier, it is the greatest engine of growth that we've ever invented. Because those mechanisms of price and competition together make that these products are going to improve and multiply all the time. Prices are going to come down all the time. It won't happen every day. Sometimes it will go up, and some because there are vagaries. The market's always flexible and adapting, but over time, that will come down. And it is one of the most amazing things is that most commodities. I think it was Paul Ehrlich, the environmentalist, who made all these daunting predictions about the starvation and the end of various commodities and how the world is going to come to an end. Took a bet with one of his colleagues some 50 years ago, where he said the basket of commodities, nickel, coal, iron, etc., will in 50 years' time be cheaper than it is today. And Ehrlich said to him, "You are nuts," because his prediction was that most of those would not only be expensive, they would have been non-existent. We would have run out of those commodities. And of course, the other guy won the bet. Most of those commodities, and as a basket of commodities, there's things that we now buy in terms of commodities: coal, oil, nickel, aluminium, etc. All of those things combined, we can exploit more cheaply. We can extract them from the earth more cheaply, and they are more plentiful on the whole. There are exceptions because some things have, but we found substitutes for those. But can you imagine that those things have actually become cheaper in terms of the amount of labor? There's one or two exceptions. One is gold because of the nature of gold and so on. But I mean, I don't need gold. I don't know about you. I'm not dependent on gold for my daily bread. So all I'm saying is, and that is exceptional. And why it's exceptional is that this is the so-called world of limited resources. You see, now what the market has done is it's found better and more efficient ways to exploit and process and use these things all the time.
Right.
So the point is we've learned to do more with less.
Right.
That's basically what productivity is. With the same amount of labor, because we have these machines, we can now make the most mostly computers nowadays. We can make the most unbelievable output possible.
Yeah.
Which 10 or 15 years ago was unthinkable.
Yeah.
And that's the result partly of competition. So what I'm saying is if you lose the price system and you have the competition, and all of this is made possible because people have freedom of choice.
Yes.
If I go to the supermarket across the road and I don't like the setup of the counters. Some supermarkets make you have a long queue, and others have you queue up at each one of the separate counters. And I, for one reason or another, prefer the other one. I simply up and go. I don't like the restaurant. The service is not good, or the place is too expensive.
Yeah.
I just vote with my feet. I just go across the road.
Yeah.
And
I had a terrible,
if enough people do that, they go out of business. They
Exactly.
just have to adapt, and they normally do.
Frans, before we wrap up, because we don't have much time left, got about 12 minutes left before I think we should wrap up. There's a number of things we could discuss, but I just thought an interesting point to end on would be a section within this chapter titled "The Argument That South Africa Should Be Modeled on Nordic Social Democracies."
Yeah.
Obviously, I think there's so much we could say about the free market, but let's.
Yeah, we'll find opportunities.
But let's just dive into that and
deal with
try and
that,
explore
yeah.
that because it's such a popular idea.
It's probably one of the most it's close to the top of the popular arguments.
Right.
We normally talk about Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Those are and the trade unions in this country are very fond of pointing to them. Now, the first point that I want to make about those countries is that they are in fact free markets. The way that we measure free markets is by looking at something like the index of the Fraser Institute, the free economic freedom of the world, and they ranked virtually all the countries in the world, 1 to 159, I think, on their level of economic freedom. And the top ones are Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, and so you come down the line. United States has broken back, incidentally, into the top 10. They lounged about 18 and 16 for quite a while under the Obamas and the Bushes of this world.
Yes.
Now, suddenly we're back.
Amazing.
US is back in the top ranks.
Wow.
Now, the interesting thing is that these countries all fall in the top quartile. That means the top 25% of free markets. So, for starters. Then if you strip out the criteria, let me just say the criteria for freedom are divided into four, one quarter of which is the size of the state. That is how much tax is taken and how much the state spends, that sort of thing. That is where these countries are relatively statist. They take high taxes and they spend it on their welfare state. If you take that out of the equation, and you look at the other three, those are things like rule of law, regulation, and labor, including labor relation, business regulation, red tape, and that sort of thing. International trade, and also the soundness of the money system, whether there's inflation or not. You look at all those criteria, the remaining 80%, and these countries move into the top 10% by and large. So their markets are extremely free, but for the fact that they levy high taxes and they expend them. And don't think that aspect does not cost them, eh? You must understand that they were the richest countries in the world. Sweden in particular, which is your model of models. Sweden in 1937 was ranked the richest country per capita in the world.
Wow.
More so than the United States, England, Germany, all of those places. What then happened was they also had the lowest state expenditure of all those states.
Yes.
And over the period from about 1937 to 1960, they gradually started increasing state spending for this welfare state. So by 60, they were more or less on a par.
And now with the migration, I wonder how that's...
Well, I'll talk to that now. But let me just say that by 1960, they already had enormous wealth and they had this famously high living standard. For example, life expectancy was almost the same as it is now. And then in the 60s, they started really investing in the welfare state. And gradually, that went up. And by about 1980, they became fairly unfree.
But I think a key point here, you correct me if I'm wrong, is that they became a welfare state because they were so wealthy.
Absolutely. They were wealthy long before they introduced the welfare
And that's what I think is one of the key points in this conversation.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why any kind of... the idea that we should model ourselves on them, I know it seems preposterous. That's right. Considering that we'd have to become almost... so absurdly wealthy to even begin to consider that.
Yeah.
It would be impossible.
The thing is that there are two answers to that. The first is that they were wealthy free market countries before they started introducing the welfare state. So that's the first answer. The second answer is, even if you look at them as they are now, they are freer than South Africa, but by a mile. So I always say to the contenders who point to those examples, let South Africa become a free market first, like those countries.
Right.
Let's emulate them, and then we can talk about welfare states and so on. But first, let's become a free market. So that's the first important point. And then the other point is that people who come from Norway and Sweden and Denmark and who live in the United States are wealthier than Norwegians and Swedes and Danes in their countries of origin. And the level of poverty in the US is lower per population than it is in those countries of origin.
Really?
Yes, and they are far, far better they're also richer than Americans, but by a mile. They are.
You mean the people who move from those countries to America?
Yes, the immigrants are both richer than their counterparts, of comparable counterparts in their countries of origin, less poor, and there was lower levels of poverty.
And what's the significance of that?
The significance of that is that there is something, and there's a Swedish economist who studied this, and he eliminated all the other factors and found that ultimately there's something to be said for the thrift and culture, the very, very extreme work ethic. You must remember, historically, they were very poor countries, they were very cold, and people had to battle to make a living, mainly from agriculture in the old days. They were poor countries. Coupled with a Protestant work ethic. It was a Protestantism which really said to them, almost this notion that we started off earlier with, of life was hard. They really examples of that.
Yeah.
And that work ethic persisted. And Sanandaji is the Swedish economist who said he can only ascribe the success of Nordics in United States, who should, if only the market or only the environment mattered, should have been on the same footing as everybody else. And he says the only reason he can find why they are so much better off is that there's still something to be said for a culture. So it is, it's not a topic which I push because you can't change culture. It's really a difficult thing to say people change your culture. What do you do? All you can do is to change the structure within which a culture is incentivized. So if you want to create a culture of thrift, reward it. Make people want to be productive. It's the only thing. And that you do by creating your free market.
Right. Well, Frans, I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks so much once again for joining me for another discussion. To our viewers, if you are interested in Frans's book, if you are working through the book, that's great. But if you're interested in buying the book, remember it's called South Africa Can Work, written by Frans Rautenbach. And it's a absolutely fantastic read, full of incredibly eye-opening data. And what I love about it is how counterintuitive it is. I think there's so much that's said in the mainstream media, so much that's sort of just blindly accepted by people, which you really challenge. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's such a good book. Anyways, Frans, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's enough for now.
Okay, great.
Anyone who can remember all of that is going to be exceptionally successful in the free market.
So in our next video, we'll be diving into chapter 5 and looking at asset inflation. And I look forward to unpacking that with you, Frans. Thanks so much once again.
Thank you.
Cool. Cheers.